The moment Captain James Goodson laid eyes on it, something inside him sank. March 1943. RAF Debden, England. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the quiet tension of war. But what stood on the tarmac in front of him felt even heavier. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a question, a gamble, maybe even a death sentence. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt sat there like a massive, unmoving beast. 7 tons of steel, fuel, and American ambition, compared to the sleek, elegant Spitfire Goodson had flown during the Battle of Britain. This machine looked absurd, bloated, overbuilt, wrong. He had survived dogfights against the Luftwaffe. He had flown with the legendary Eagle squadrons. He knew what worked in the sky, and this didn't look like it belonged there at all. And yet, this was now his aircraft. What Goodson and the other skeptical pilot around him couldn't possibly know was this. Within 18 months, this same flying barrel will become one of the most feared weapons in the entire European theater. Hardened German veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet fighters without hesitation would one day speak of the Thunderbolt in quiet, uneasy tones. But in March 1943, none of that existed yet. Right now, the P-47 was a joke. The men assigned to fly it came from one of the most controversial units in the U.S. Army Air Forces, the 56 Fighter Group. They had been the first to receive the new fighter back in the summer of 1942 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, was not a man easily impressed. He had already seen combat conditions firsthand while observing with the Royal Air Force in 1940. He understood the Luftwaffe. He understood what real air combat demanded. And when he first saw the Thunderbolt, he wasn't convinced. The numbers alone were enough to raise eyebrows. The aircraft weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, far heavier than anything it was meant to replace. It stood tall, wide, and bulky, with a cockpit so high off the ground that pilots joked they needed a ladder just to climb in. It didn't look fast. It didn't look agile. It certainly didn't look like a dogfighter. Pilots didn't hold back their opinions. One compared flying it to strapping himself to a bathtub and throwing it into the sky. Another said it handled like a locomotive. Powerful, yes, but slow to respond and impossible finesse. None of these comparisons were meant as compliments. But the real fear didn't come from how the aircraft looked. It came from what it did during training. Learning to fly the P-47 was deadly. Before the 56 Fighter Group ever left American soil, 18 pilots were killed in training accidents. 41 aircraft were destroyed. The Thunderbolt had a vicious torque on takeoff, unpredictable handling during landing, and a terrifying tendency to dive faster than pilots could control. During steep dives, something strange and dangerous happened. Shock waves formed over the wings, and suddenly, the controls stopped responding. Pilots were unknowingly pushing into the edge of the sound barrier, and they were doing it in an aircraft that felt too heavy to save if something went wrong. Every takeoff felt like a risk. Every landing, a gamble. But then something unexpected began to emerge from the wreckage. When the Thunderbolt crashed, the pilots lived. Again and again, aircraft were destroyed, spun into the ground, torn apart on impact, or smashed into force. But the men inside often walked away, bruised, shaken, burned, but alive. It didn't make sense at first. Then slowly, quietly, a realization began to spread among the survivors. This aircraft was incredibly hard to kill. On January 6, 1943, the 56 Fighter Group boarded the RMS Queen Elizabeth and crossed the Atlantic to England. They carried with them doubts, frustration, and a machine they didn't yet trust. But Zemke had been thinking ahead. He knew something others didn't, or at least something they hadn't yet accepted. The P-47 was not a Spitfire. It was never meant to be. Try to fight it like one would get pilots killed. So he began developing new tactics, ones that would work with the aircraft instead of against it. He focused on what the Thunderbolt could do. It could dive faster than anything else in the sky. It could roll with surprising stability at high speed. It carried massive firepower. 8.50 caliber machine guns capable of shredding anything in front of it. And at high altitude, its turbo-supercharged engine gave a performance edge that few enemy aircraft could match. Zemke didn't try to fix the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. He built a strategy around its strengths. When the group arrived in England, they found they weren't alone in their frustration. Other American units were already transitioning to the P-47, and many of those pilots hated it just as much. The 78 Fighter Group had lost their previous aircraft and were forced into the Thunderbolt. The 4th Fighter Group, made up of experienced American pilots who had flown British Spitfires, were especially bitter. They were being forced to give up aircraft they trusted for something they didn't believe in. One of their leaders, Major Don Blakesley, had already seen combat against German fighters. He knew exactly how dangerous the skies over Europe were. When he first flew the P-47, his reaction was immediate and brutal. Compared to the nimble Spitfire, the Thunderbolt felt like a burden. Too heavy, too slow to climb, too unresponsive in a turn. His judgment became infamous. "It ought to be able to dive," he said dryly. "It certainly can't climb." Even British pilots, known for their discipline, couldn't hide their skepticism. They examined the aircraft, shook their heads, and quietly warned Americans that flying this machine against German fighters was close to suicide. Some even joked that the best escape maneuver in a P-47 was to unbuckle your seatbelt and run around inside the fuselage. The cockpit, after all, was big enough. And then came the first mission. April 8, 1943. The Thunderbolt's combat debut over occupied France. It should have been a routine fighter sweep. Instead, it turned into chaos. Radios failed. Formations broke apart. Coordination collapsed. No enemy aircraft were even engaged properly. But every pilot returned with the same unsettling thought. If this was the aircraft they were supposed to win the war with, they were in serious trouble. Across the channel, German pilots heard reports of the new American fighter and reacted with amusement. It looked ridiculous. Too large, too clumsy, too easy. They mocked it openly, calling a fat target pretending to be a fighter. To them, it wasn't a threat. Not yet, but everything was about to change. Just days later, on April 15, 1943, the P-47 would finally meet the Luftwaffe in real combat. And in that moment, one pilot would discover something that would begin to rewrite everything they thought they knew about the Thunderbolt. Just days later, on April 15, 1943, the P-47 would finally meet the Luftwaffe in real combat. And in that moment, one pilot would discover something that would begin to rewrite everything they thought they knew about the Thunderbolt. Major Don Blakesley, the same man who had dismissed the aircraft as unfit for climbing, led the mission that day. The sky over Belgium was clear, deceptively calm, the kind of calm that often hid violence just beneath its surface. Then he saw it. Below him, cutting through the air with deadly elegance, was a German Focke-Wulf 190, one of the finest fighters in the world. Fast, agile, and flown by some of the most experienced pilots of the war, it was everything the P-47 was not supposed to be able to defeat. For a brief moment, instinct took over. Blakesley didn't hesitate. He rolled his massive Thunderbolt into position and pushed the nose down. What happened next surprised him. The aircraft began to accelerate. Fast, faster than he expected. The speed climbed rapidly. 400 miles per hour. 450, pushing toward 500. The Thunderbolt, heavy and mocked for its size, suddenly felt like something else entirely. Unstoppable. The German pilot reacted, trying to evade, but it didn't matter. The distance closed too quickly. The P-47 was no longer chasing. It was falling. Blakesley squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted at once, sending a stream of fire forward with terrifying force. The tracers found their mark almost instantly. The FW-190 burst into flames and spiraled toward the below. The Thunderbolt had just scored its first kill. When Blakesley returned to base, the mood had shifted slightly but noticeably. Captain James Goodson met him as he climbed out of the cockpit. "I told you the Jug could outdive them," Goodson said. Blakesley didn't smile. "Well," he replied dryly, "it damn well ought to be able to dive. It sure as hell can't climb." It wasn't praise, but it wasn't dismissal anymore either. Something had changed. In the weeks that followed, a few pilots began to notice what others were still missing. One of them was a young lieutenant from Oklahoma, Robert Samuel Johnson. Unlike many of his fellow pilots, Johnson wasn't focused on what the Thunderbolt couldn't do. He paid attention to what it did differently, and what he saw intrigued him. In a dive, the aircraft felt solid, almost unnaturally stable. While other fighters became unpredictable at high speeds, the P-47 held its line like it was locked onto rails. Its firepower was overwhelming. 8 heavy machine guns, each loaded with hundreds of rounds, could tear apart an enemy aircraft in seconds. And its engine, the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800, seemed indestructible. It kept running, no matter what. Johnson didn't just respect the aircraft. He began to trust it. He had no idea how important that trust would become. June 26, 1943. A mission that was supposed to be routine. Escort bombers to an airfield near Paris. Maintain formation. Return home. Simple. Except war rarely follows simple plans. Johnson was flying at the rear of a formation of 48 Thunderbolts. The sky was clear, but danger came from where it always did. Above, out of the sun, a formation of German FW-190s dropped like predators. The attack was sudden, precise, devastating. The first pass shattered the American formation. Aircraft scattered in every direction. Each pilot left to fight alone, and Johnson became the primary target. The first hits came fast. Explosive 20mm cannon shells slammed into his aircraft, one after another. Each impact tore through metal like paper. The cockpit shook violently. His hydraulic system exploded, spraying fluid everywhere. The canopy shattered. A bullet grazed his nose, destroying his oxygen mask. Then came fire. Flames spread through the cockpit. Instruments disintegrated. For a moment, everything blurred into chaos as the aircraft began to spin. Below him, the French countryside rushed closer. This was it. But Johnson refused to give up. He fought the controls, what little control he had left, kicked the rudder, pulled against the spin, and somehow the aircraft responded. The fire died down. The spin stopped. He was still in the air, still alive, but the nightmare wasn't over. A German fighter moved into position behind him. The pilot was experienced, deadly, precise. This wasn't just another enemy. This was an ace. The German opened fire. Rounds tore into the already crippled Thunderbolt. Johnson couldn't fight back. He could barely see. Hydraulic fluid burned his eyes. The shattered canopy made escape impossible. All he could do was hold the aircraft steady and wait. The German pilot attacked again and again. Each pass brought more damage, more impacts, more destruction. Johnson began counting the hits. He stopped after 200. The wings were shredded, the fuselage torn apart. The engine, somehow, still running. The Thunderbolt refused to die. Then something unbelievable happened. After multiple attack runs, the German pilot pulled up alongside Johnson's aircraft. For a brief moment, the two pilots flew side by side. Johnson, barely conscious, turned his head. He expected one final burst of gunfire. Instead, the German pilot shook his head, not in anger, in disbelief. He had fired everything he had, and the American aircraft was still flying. Out of ammunition, the Germans simply turned away and disappeared into the distance. Johnson was alone again, but alive. Getting back to England was another battle. The aircraft was barely holding together. Systems were destroyed, controls damaged, the cockpit filled with smoke and heat. But the engine kept running, and slowly, painfully, Johnson guided the broken Thunderbolt back across the channel. When he finally landed, ground crews rushed toward him. They had to pry him out of the cockpit. His body was covered in burns. Shrapnel wounds lined his skin, his face blackened with smoke. Then they looked at the aircraft, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Bullet holes covered the fuselage. Dozens, then hundreds. Cannon shells had torn through critical sections. By all logic, by all experience, by every rule of aerial combat, this aircraft should not have made it home. But it had. 5 days later, Robert Johnson was back in the air, flying a new Thunderbolt. He named it Lucky, and over time, he would go on to score 27 aerial victories, becoming one of the most successful American pilots in Europe. Every single one of those victories would come in the same aircraft everyone had once dismissed, the same aircraft that had just saved his life. But even as individual stories like Johnson's began to spread, the overall situation remained dangerous. The Luftwaffe was still powerful. Experienced German pilots dominated the skies. And statistically, the Americans were still losing more aircraft than they destroyed. Something had to change. That change would come not from the machine, but from the man who had refused to give up on it from the beginning, Colonel Hubert Zemke. He had been watching, learning, adapting, and now he was ready to prove that the Thunderbolt wasn't a failure. It had simply been misunderstood. What he introduced next would not only transform the P-47, it would transform the entire nature of aerial combat. That realization would soon be tested in battles that would push both the pilots and their machine to the absolute limit. Because as 1943 moved into its most intense phase, the skies over Europe became a proving ground where only the strongest tactics and the toughest aircraft would survive. And it was here that the P-47 Thunderbolt began its true transformation, not just as a fighter, but as a weapon that would redefine aerial combat itself. As missions grew larger, more dangerous, and far more deadly, with bomber formations pushing deeper into German-controlled territory, escorted by fighters that were still learning, still adapting, and often still paying a price for every mistake. Yet among those pilots was Robert Johnson, now no longer just a survivor but growing force in the air, gaining confidence with every mission as he applied the very tactics Zemke had drilled into them, climbing high above the battlefield, watching patiently, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when he did, the results were devastating, because by now the Thunderbolt's strengths were no longer theoretical, they were proven, and every successful attack reinforced a simple truth: if flown correctly, this aircraft was not a disadvantage. It was an advantage. One of the most defining moments came during a massive bomber escort mission over Germany, where the stakes were higher than ever, as waves of American bombers pushed toward heavily defended targets, knowing full well that the Luftwaffe would respond with everything it had. And high above the formation, Johnson found himself alone again, separated in the chaos, scanning the skies for any sign of movement, until his eyes locked onto a lone German fighter below, stalking a damaged bomber, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And without hesitation, Johnson rolled his aircraft into a dive, the Thunderbolt accelerating rapidly, the wind screaming past the cockpit as gravity and engine power combined into a force that felt almost unstoppable. And as he closed the distance, the German pilot remained unaware, focused entirely on his prey, never realizing that death was now descending from above. But this was no ordinary enemy. This was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and deadly aces, a pilot who had survived hundreds of missions, a man who had faced every kind of threat the war could offer and lived to tell the tale. Yet even he could not escape what came next, because the Thunderbolt, diving at incredible speed, gave him no time to react, no chance to maneuver, and when Johnson's guns opened fire, the impact was immediate and catastrophic, bullets tearing through the aircraft from end to end, shredding metal, destroying systems. And within seconds, the German fighter exploded, vanishing in a fireball that marked the end of a long and deadly career. And in that moment, something shifted, not just for Johnson, but for the entire war in the air, because if even the most skilled and experienced pilots could be taken down so quickly, so decisively, then no one was truly safe anymore. The psychological impact of encounters like this spread rapidly through the Luftwaffe, as reports came in describing a new kind of threat, not a nimble dogfighter, but a high-speed predator that struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation was possible. And German pilots began to realize that traditional tactics were no longer enough, because the Thunderbolt did not fight by the old rules. It didn't need to outturn or outclimb. It simply needed altitude, speed, and firepower. And with those three elements combined, it became something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. And as if that wasn't enough, technological advancements began to push the aircraft even further, turning it from a capable fighter into a near unstoppable force. One of the most significant upgrades came with the introduction of war emergency power, a system that allowed the engine to produce a sudden burst of additional horsepower by injecting a mixture into the intake, dramatically increasing performance for short periods of time. And for pilots, the effect was immediate and almost shocking, as if an invisible force had suddenly grabbed the aircraft and hurled it forward. Acceleration became sharper, climbs became faster, and the Thunderbolt, once criticized for being sluggish, began to close the gap on enemy fighters that previously could have escaped with ease, and combined with improvements like the new paddle blade propeller, would allow the engine's immense power to be converted more efficiently into thrust. The aircraft performance was transformed, climb rates improved, responsiveness increased, and suddenly, the weaknesses that had once defined the P-47 were no longer as limiting as they had been before. By early 1944, the change was undeniable. The Thunderbolt had evolved into a machine that could compete on equal terms with the best fighters in the world, and in many situations dominate them. And the pilots who once doubted it were now mastering it, adapting their strategies, refining their attacks, and building a level of confidence that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. And nowhere was this more evident than in the actions of pilots like Francis Gabreski, who had initially struggled with the aircraft, but gradually became one of its most effective and deadly operators, scoring victories and proving that the Thunderbolt was more than capable of achieving dominance in the skies. As missions continued, the Thunderbolt's role began to expand, moving beyond pure air-to-air combat and into a new and devastating domain, ground attack, where its combination of durability and firepower made it uniquely suited for destroying targets below. And this shift would prove to be one of the most important developments of the war, because while air superiority was critical, the ability to cripple enemy infrastructure, destroy supply lines, and directly support ground forces could change the outcome of entire campaigns, and the P-47 was perfectly positioned to do exactly that, carrying bombs, rockets, and already formidable machine guns into battle, turning it into a flying tank that could strike with precision and survive the intense anti-aircraft fire that came with low-level attacks. And as the Allied invasion of Europe approached, this capability would become even more critical, because the success of the landings would depend not just on the troops on the ground, but on the aircraft above them, controlling the skies, disrupting enemy movements, and ensuring that German forces could not respond effectively. And the Thunderbolt, once dismissed as a failure, was now preparing to play a central role in one of the most important operations in history, a role that would push it to its limits and cement its place as one of the most formidable aircraft of the war, as the pilots who flew it braced themselves for the battles that were coming, knowing that what lay ahead would test everything they had learned, everything they had survived, and everything this machine was capable of delivering. And everything this machine was capable of delivering would soon be unleashed on a scale no one had ever witnessed before. Because when June 1944 arrived, the long-awaited invasion of Normandy began. And with it came a moment that would define not only the war, but the true power of the P-47 Thunderbolt, as hundreds of these aircraft filled the skies from dawn until dusk, forming a relentless shield over the Allied forces, landing on the beaches below. Wave after wave of Thunderbolts patrolling every altitude, every direction, leaving no space for German fighters to break through. And those who tried quickly learned just how deadly this new reality had become, because the skies were no longer contested territory. They belonged to the Americans, and the Thunderbolt was one of the primary reasons why. German pilots who attempted to reach the beaches found themselves trapped in a nightmare, unable to climb above the patrols or dive beneath them, constantly under threat from aircraft that could appear at any moment, diving at terrifying speeds and unleashing devastating firepower before vanishing again. And reports from surviving Luftwaffe pilots painted a grim picture, describing skies filled with Thunderbolts stacked layer upon layer, each one ready to strike, each one contributing to an aerial dominance that was nearly impossible to challenge. And for the men on the ground, both Allied and German, the presence of these aircraft was impossible to ignore because their impact extended far beyond air combat, reaching down into the battlefield itself where their true destructive potential began to unfold. In the days and weeks following the landings, the role of the Thunderbolt expanded rapidly, transforming it from a high-altitude fighter into one of the most effective ground attack weapons of the entire war, as pilots began flying low over enemy territory, targeting convoys, rail lines, supply depots, and anything else that supported the German war effort. And it was here that the aircraft's design truly shined, because its heavy armor and incredible durability allowed it to withstand the intense anti-aircraft fire that came with such missions, while its firepower ensured that anything it targeted would be destroyed with overwhelming force. And soon, the German army learned to fear a new word, a term that would become synonymous with destruction from above: the J-bow, short for fighter bomber, and among all the J-bows operating over Europe, none were more feared than the Thunderbolt. One of the most devastating examples of this power came during Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy, where German forces found themselves trapped on narrow roads, their vehicles packed tightly together as they attempted to retreat or reposition, creating the perfect target for aerial attack. And when the Thunderbolts arrived, they turned those roads into killing zones, attacking continuously for hours, diving again and again, releasing bombs, firing rockets, and strafing with their machine guns, leaving behind a trail of destruction that was almost unimaginable. Tanks burned, trucks exploded, entire columns were wiped out, and by the time it was over, what had once been a powerful armored force was reduced to twisted metal and scattered debris, a clear demonstration of what the Thunderbolt could do when unleashed on ground targets. The mathematics of its firepower were staggering. Each aircraft carrying 8 heavy machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds in just seconds, bullets that could penetrate armor, ignite fuel, and tear through vehicles with ease, and pilots quickly learned how to maximize this destructive capability, developing techniques that targeted the weakest points of enemy armor, attacking from angles that exposed vulnerable areas, and using speed and precision to deliver devastating blows before enemy defenses could react. And as these tactics improved, so did the results, with the Thunderbolt becoming one of the most effective tools for dismantling the German war machine from the air. Throughout the summer and into the autumn of 1944, this pattern continued, with Thunderbolts flying thousands of missions, striking targets across France and beyond, systematically destroying transportation networks, cutting off supply lines, and making it increasingly difficult for German forces to operate effectively. And as the pressure mounted, the impact of these attacks became impossible to ignore. Trains were destroyed before they could deliver supplies. Convoys were eliminated before they could reach the front lines, and entire units found themselves isolated and vulnerable, unable to move without risking destruction from above. And in this environment, the Thunderbolt was not just a weapon, it was a constant threat, a presence that could appear at any moment and change the course of battle in seconds. Even as the war dragged into the harsh winter months, when weather conditions often limited air operations, the Thunderbolt continued to play a critical role whenever conditions allowed. And during the Battle of Bulge, one of Germany's last major offensives, its impact was once again felt. As soon as the skies cleared, Thunderbolts returned in force, attacking advancing columns, disrupting movements, and helping to slow and eventually halt the German advance. And in engagements where enemy forces were caught exposed, the results were devastating, with entire convoys destroyed in a matter of hours, proving once again that control of the air could determine the outcome on the ground. Yet despite all this success, the missions remained dangerous, because low-level attacks exposed pilots to intense anti-aircraft fire, and losses continued to occur, reminding everyone that even the most capable aircraft could not eliminate risk entirely. But what set the Thunderbolt apart was its ability to bring its pilots home, time and time again, even after sustaining damage that would have destroyed other fighters. Stories continued to emerge of aircraft returning with massive holes in their wings, engines barely functioning, structures barely intact, yet still managing to land safely. And these stories reinforce what pilots had come to understand to experience, that this aircraft, more than any other, was built to survive. As the war moved toward its final stages, the Thunderbolt had fully shed its early reputation, no longer seen as a flawed or inferior machine, but as one of the most reliable and effective aircraft in the Allied arsenal, respected by those who flew it and feared by those who faced it. And the transformation that had begun with doubt and skepticism had now reached its peak, with the P-47 standing as a symbol of adaptability, resilience, and overwhelming firepower, ready to carry its pilots through the final battles that would ultimately bring the war in Europe to an end, as both sides prepared for the last and most phase of the conflict, where every advantage would matter, and every weapon would be pushed to its limits. As the war entered its final phase, and by the spring of 1945, the transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt was complete. The same aircraft that had once been mocked as a clumsy, oversized liability was now one of the most feared and respected machines in the skies over Europe. And the numbers it produced told a story that no criticism could ever erase. Hundreds of thousands of sorties flown, thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, and an almost unimaginable level of devastation inflicted on ground targets, railways shattered, supply lines cut, entire armored formations wiped out under the relentless assault of Thunderbolts that seemed to appear everywhere at once, and for the German forces still fighting a losing battle. The presence of these aircraft meant one thing above all else. Survival had become a matter of luck rather than skill. The 56th Fighter Group, the very unit that had once struggled to even trust the aircraft they were given, now stood as one of the most successful fighter groups of the war, refusing to abandon their Thunderbolts even when other units transitioned to newer aircraft, because they understood something others had only come to realize later, that this machine, with all its weight and raw power, offered something no sleek design could guarantee: the ability to survive and keep fighting, and their record proved it, with hundreds upon hundreds of confirmed victories, both in the air and on the ground, achieved not through elegance, but through relentless effectiveness. And as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the Thunderbolt continued to play its role, striking targets across collapsing enemy lines, ensuring that resistance weakened with every passing day. German pilots, many of whom had once laughed at the sight of the P-47, no longer found anything amusing about it. Because experience had taught them a harsh lesson, this was not an aircraft to be underestimated. This was a machine that could absorb punishment far beyond what seemed possible, continue flying when logic said it should fall, and deliver devastating firepower in return. And even some of the most accomplished German aces would later admit that facing a Thunderbolt required extreme caution, because one had the advantage. Escape was often the only option, and even that was not guaranteed, because when a P-47 committed to an attack, especially from altitude, there was very little a pilot could do to avoid what came next. The final statistics of the war painted a picture of overwhelming impact: more than 15,000 Thunderbolts built, hundreds of thousands of missions flown, and a kill ratio that demonstrated not just effectiveness, but dominance. And beyond the numbers were the countless stories: pilots returning in aircraft that looked like they should have been written off long before they touched the runway, machines riddled with bullet holes, wings bent, engines damaged, yet still carrying their pilots safely home. And these stories became the true legacy of the Thunderbolt, because while victories and destruction could be measured, survival could not. And for men who flew these missions, that was what mattered most. As the war finally came to an end, the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt extended far beyond the battlefield, influencing the way future aircraft would be designed, emphasizing not just speed and agility, but durability, firepower, and the ability to protect the pilot, principles that would continue to shape military aviation for decades to come. And the lessons learned from a Thunderbolt would live on in future aircraft that carried forward its philosophy: machines built not just to fight, but to endure, to survive, and to bring their pilots back no matter the odds. For the men who had flown it, the Thunderbolt was more than just a machine. It was a lifeline, a partner in the air that carried them through some of the most dangerous moments of their lives. And many of them would go on to remember it not for its flaws, but for what it had given them a chance to come home. And among those men were pilots like Robert Johnson and Francis Gabreski, individuals who had not only survived the war, but had become legends in their own right. Their achievements, tied inseparably to the aircraft they had once doubted, but ultimately came to trust above all else. Johnson, who had once endured a near impossible battle in the skies over France, would go on to complete dozens of missions, his story becoming a symbol of both human resilience and mechanical strength, while Gabreski, rise and become one of the top aces of the European theater, proved that mastery of the Thunderbolt could lead to extraordinary success, and their experiences, along with those of countless other pilots, formed a collective narrative that defined the aircraft's place in history, not as the fastest or most agile fighter, but as one of the most dependable and devastating ever built. Even decades after the war, the memory of the Thunderbolt remained strong, not just in museums or history books, but in the stories shared by those who had witnessed its power firsthand. Stories of a machine that defied expectations, that turned skepticism into respect, and that ultimately changed the way aerial combat was understood, because it proved that victory did not always belong to the fastest or the most graceful, but often the one that could endure the longest and hit the hardest. In the end, the journey of the P-47 Thunderbolt was one of transformation, from ridicule to respect, from doubt to dominance, a journey shaped by the pilots who flew it and the battles they fought. And as history looked back on the skies of World War II, one truth stood out clearly: the Thunderbolt did not need to be perfect. It did not need to be elegant. It only needed to do its job: to fight, to survive, and to win. And in that, it succeeded beyond anything anyone had imagined at that cold airfield in March 1943, when a group of skeptical pilots first looked at a massive, awkward machine and wondered how they were supposed to trust it with their lives, only to discover, through fire and combat, that it would become one of the greatest weapons they would ever fly.